GM Arbinauts, and welcome back to a new AMA with the Arbitrum in the Arbitrum ecosystem. Today, we are very excited to be hosting this AMA with Connext Network, and Churro is our guest host and Arbitrum contributor that will be leading this AMA. So let's get started.
Yeah, thank you for the intro, Anna. And yeah, we're really excited to host Connext. Arjun, welcome to the stage. Do you want to give us a short intro about yourself and Connext as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here and really great to meet all of you. I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Connext. I've been in this space since 2016. I've been sort of involved in like building infrastructure in the earliest Ethereum days, and then started Connext in 2017 to try to solve problems associated with bringing Ethereum to many, many more people. I think everyone talks about like how do we onboard the next billion users? Well, that was something that we started talking about like in 2017, and as did many other projects. I think the conversation is still in a very similar place to where it was back then. Connext is a protocol for communicating between blockchains. We're specifically very optimized for communicating between rollups. We do things that are a little bit different than other interop/bridging protocols. So of course we do, token bridging, and we focus on bridging messages as well. But one of the big differences between how Connext works and how other ecosystems work is that Connext's thesis is that we already have really good infrastructure for securing messages that go between chains. And these are the rollup bridges. In fact, this was the whole point of rollups in the first place. How Connext works is that we layer on top of the existing kind of L2 to L1 rollup bridges to pass messages and funds between chains. And on top of all of this, we have an intent network. And I can go into what that is in a little bit. But we have a system that sits on top that allows external actors, third-party service providers, to be able to fast forward transactions that go across chains. And so with basically no kind of like security trade-offs whatsoever, users can do things like transfer tokens between chains, and especially between rollups, do like contract calls, so like, trade on dexes, deposit into liquidity pools, and then even more kind of sophisticated interactions, all in like 20 seconds, 20 to 40 seconds, depending on the chain that you're sending from. I guess as a final note, Connext has been live for quite a while. As I mentioned, we've been around since 2017, and we ended up starting to focus on this interop problem in 2020. Before that, we were some of the earliest kind of L2 developers in the space, and worked really, really closely with other folks like the Off-Chain Labs team back in like 2018, 2019 to start figuring out what this whole like what this whole like scalable Ethereum multi-rollup world looks like. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's very cool. And yeah, I'm wondering, like, in terms of interoperability. I know back in 2017 or the early days of Ethereum, you didn't have that, but like, how did you see this evolving ever since? Up until now, um, has there, obviously there's been changes and there's been developments on that front, in terms of bridging and cross-chain interoperability. But I'm wondering, like, what has that journey been like for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think one thing that people don't realize, especially if you're kind of newer to the space, you see sort of like, rollups, and then you see bridges as like two independent market categories. But these are actually the same kind of core problem. In fact, when you look at like the first kind of paper that was authored about rollups, or even some of the earlier research that was leading to rollups, a lot of it was based around sidechains. It was based around like, how can we scale Ethereum? The answer to that question was always, okay, well, let's create more chains that look and behave like Ethereum, and find a way to trustlessly connect them to the base chain. And that problem led us to a bunch of different constructions. Initially in like 2018, 2019, this was like Plasma. And then eventually that, we kind of realized that there wasn't really a great way to make Plasma work without introducing some trust or introducing some trade-offs. And so the space started heading towards rollups as a model where it's basically another chain. You have two independent chains, except now there's like a strict hierarchy of one chain versus another. And this is kind of how we ended up where we are today. And so for kind of anyone in this space that is thinking about scalability, and you end up researching more deeply into scalability, you realize that like really the thing that everybody spent all of this time researching and perfecting was how do you make a perfect bridge to another chain? And that perfect bridge is the rollup bridge. That is the solution to that problem. So now we're kind of at to the, once we did that, we kind of got to the secondary stage of like, okay, we've made this perfect bridge to another chain, which is the rollup bridge. Now, how do we make it usable? And that's been the problem that we've been focused on, is like, the bridge, it's almost like the bridges to these other chains, the rollup bridges that we've created, they need their own layer 2 in order to actually be something that people can use on a day-to-day basis, and not have to worry about like the high costs of going through Ethereum, or like the 7-day exit window of the optimistic rollups.
Yeah, that's very cool. And yeah, that is really interesting in terms of like how that space like evolved in terms of the bridges and the on-chain interoperability. I think that's really cool. And yeah, I also wanted to ask a follow-up question on that topic. I mean, for you guys, Connext. What are some like challenges you guys have seen so far today, in terms of cross-chain interoperability for rollups, right? Yeah, what are some challenges, and also in terms of the future, where can we see this space going?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the challenges that bridges have experienced, right? So there's kind of a lot of the lower level challenges. So like, how do you even build bridges safely and correctly in the first place? And we've seen that, over the last couple of years, we've just seen a ton of people get this wrong. There's been so many bridge hacks, leading to so much lost value. And a large part of that comes from the fact that we just didn't know how to build these things. And so the way that people were building them was just like rolling new custom infrastructure. There was no code bases that we could rely on. It's not like a rollup where you're relying on the EVM code base. Instead, you're kind of we were trying to build things totally from scratch, without really knowing how to even build it correctly in the first place. I think I think this is still a bit of a challenge for rollups, in the sense that, at this moment, there's only like 2 to 3 systems out there that actually give you rollup level security when bridging. And that's really just like across Hop and Connext. Everything else introduces another kind of third-party set of actors. So it's like, systems like there's a lot of systems that have like a chain, and that chain in between is like the interoperability layer, right? So that includes things like Axelar and Wormhole. It includes like a bunch of the other kinds of like constructions that are out there. It also included things like multi-chain in the past. And these constructions are awesome, and we of course like understand the trade-offs of like having a chain in between quite well. But of course, like, if the whole goal of a rollup was, let's find a way to make this thing that is exactly as secure as Ethereum and has the same trust assumptions as Ethereum, putting another chain in between when you're doing interop between rollups ends up, of course, introducing some security risks and security assumptions. I think that that's a challenge that is going to continue into the future, where there's kind of trade-offs associated with this stuff, where interop that goes through the rollup base layers is more complex and more difficult to kind of figure out. But of course, it's like safer in the long run. And I think over time, we're going to find that like we find better and better ways to do that process as like research gets better. And so like the direction that a lot of that is going, and the direction that we're headed, is towards things like intent, as I mentioned earlier, where you have like, this is an idea that's been like popularized recently by Uniswap and with Uniswap X, but it's a notion that's kind of been around for quite a while. But the core principle is that you just have a set of off-chain actors that are basically providing the service of executing transactions on behalf of users, and in this case, executing them across chains. And this can be done with like little or no trust whatsoever. So that's kind of like one avenue this is going. And then the other avenue is shared sequencing. So there's of course been a lot of discussion in both like the Arbitrum ecosystem, as well as pretty much every other rollup ecosystem, around like, building native interoperability between like Orbit rollups, or OP Stack rollups, or whatever. And I think that native interoperability looks something like a shared sequencing mechanism. The other challenge that I think is kind of interesting, that's also worth paying attention to, is like token bridging. So of course, token bridging is like a specific use case of the bigger kind of bridging problem. So you have like you could bridge, if you could bridge like any kind of message or data between chains, well, tokens are one very specific instance of that. But tokens, because of the way that they're constructed and because of some of the like design decisions around how ERC20 tokens first existed on Ethereum, took their own unique set of challenges associated with bridging. And some of those challenges that we see today are things like fragmented liquidity. So every bridge has to go and build liquidity on every chain that they support. So there's an interesting question here around like, okay, if people go and create 100 new Arbitrum orbit chains, how do those orbit chains get liquidity? How do they actually get to the point where there is seamless communication between them without having to go and like build a liquidity pool on each chain individually? And then of course, like, if you're not going the liquidity pathway, then what other risks exist? So what systemic risks are you creating for your token by like working with some third-party bridge or something like that? I think the direction a lot of those questions are going is towards better bridging standards. So we at Connext have helped like pioneer one open standard, which is an ERC called ERC7281, which we call xERC20. And the goal here is just to create like more neutral approaches where multiple bridges can like share liquidity of the same token or can have minting and burning rights of a single token. And just those kinds of coordination mechanisms over time, I think can help like reduce this like particular challenges of bridging, especially in a world where there's potentially hundreds of rollups.
Yeah, no, I think with Arbitrum Orbit, yeah, that's a interesting interesting thought on that. And I'm wondering like too, like how can Connext play a role within the Arbitrum Orbit ecosystem? I mean, you mentioned that there could possibly be over like 100 different orbit chains. So I'm wondering, like, is there a way that you guys plan to play a role in that to help improve that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think my kind of vision for this feature is like, you should be able to create a rollup in the same way that you create a server on the internet today, right? You should just be able to like go to UI, similar to like AWS for like Amazon's web services. If you're a developer and like, go and just provision a server, and that server should, of course, it should come connected to the internet. It would be kind of ridiculous for it to not come connected to the internet. And I think we sort of, at least my view is that the space sort of needs to like head towards the same direction where, tomorrow, if you decide to go and deploy an Arbitrum orbit chain, that orbit chain should ship with a connection to the rest of the orbit ecosystem at the very least, and if not, to basically the rest of the interchain, so the rest of every other chain that exists out there. And that should happen in a way that's like permissionless. It should just work out of the box. It should happen in a way where you're not having to then go and like bootstrap liquidity and do a bunch of these other kinds of like secondary steps to make it work. And it should also happen in a way where you're not giving up like some of the core security decisions that you made when spinning up your orbit chain in the first place. That's the direction that we're headed. We really feel strongly that this is like what the space needs to get to in order for the whole ecosystem to succeed. So how Connext handles this is that we're trying to tackle each of these problems individually. We want to make it so that it's very, very, very easy to support Connext on any chain, and especially on L3s like Orbit, because in an L3 like Orbit, we understand exactly what that like system is going to look like. We understand that it's going to rely on Arbitrum. We understand that Arbitrum is posting to Ethereum, so we can be very confident in its security. And then beyond that, we are trying to like push for, this is one of the biggest reasons we're trying to push for xERC20, is we see that as like a fundamental driver for how Connext and even other bridging systems can just like support many, many chains and have them work out of the box. So yeah, I think to answer your question, we want to lead, like for us, leaning into that 100 Arbitrum orbit rollup world means basically getting to the point where Connext is as permissionless as possible.
Right. No, that's such an amazing initiative from you guys. So yeah, I'm really curious to see how that comes out. And you mentioned xERC20. Do you maybe want to give the community some background about like what is it and why it's needed and how can projects implement it?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, xERC20 is an EIP. It's basically an open standard that we've submitted for a public RFC. The standard doesn't really technically have anything to do with Connext, and like there is no reason why anyone can't use it. That's the whole point, is that it's really just like a very simple standard interface. It's actually a very, very simple extension to how existing tokens work. And what that extension does is just three really very straightforward things. One, it adds minting and burning ability to an ERC20 token. And I can get more into, I'll cover exactly why we do these things in a minute. So it adds minting and burning ability to the token. Two, it allows for basically like a whitelist of bridges that can call the minting and burning ability, and that whitelist is controlled by the owner of the token. And then three, it allows the owner to set limits, like basically rate limits, so limits per block, and also caps on the amount of tokens that can be minted by each bridge. Now, the goal of this is that today we have this really complex situation where, in order for, if you're a token issuer trying to bring your token to many different chains, so say, for example, you're Lido and you want to bring staked ETH to many different chains. Right now, that process is actually super fragmented. You kind of have to think about each chain individually and make a decision on each chain kind of one by one. And most of the time, you end up in like basically one of two places. You either work with some like third-party bridge, and that third-party bridge is like basically like controls the supply of your token from that point onwards, because they're the ones that are kind of able to mint and burn your token across chains. Or you lock into a canonical bridge. So this would be something like the Arbitrum rollup bridge. Now, obviously the Arbitrum rollup bridge is the safer option and is generally considered the best practice. If there is a canonical bridge or a rollup bridge available, you should try to use it. The challenge is when you do that, you end up kind of like fragmenting your liquidity, because now your tokens are locked into a bunch of different bridges independently. And the token that is minted on Arbitrum on the other side is not one that other bridges have rights to mint. And because they don't have rights to mint it, every bridge now has to go and build liquidity against the token. So a good example of this is like, staked ETH is a great example, where like staked ETH is bridged to Arbitrum, but in order for other bridges to support staked ETH in their bridges, we all need to go and build liquidity for staked ETH independently. This works for staked ETH, but it doesn't really work for every token. It works for staked ETH because staked ETH is huge and it has native yield. But for the vast majority of tokens, there's not really a lot of incentive for LPs to go and just hold the token. For this reason, there's many instances now of projects that have just been going and onboarding into more proprietary token standards. So things like the layer 0 OFT. And the challenge with this is when you go and work with a single kind of proprietary, vendor locked token standard, as a token issuer, you're pretty much just locked into that system forever. This happened recently with like a bunch of, like with multi-chain, for instance, where when multi-chain was, when the multi-chain incident happened, I'm still not quite clear on exactly what happened, but when the incident happened, there were a bunch of token issuers, folks like Alchemix, StapRadar, Beefy, many others that had to try to, as an emergency, try to figure out how they could get their tokens off of multi-chain and get them onto some other bridge. And the sad reality is, like, once you mint a token using some like standardized token, like some token standard that is locked in, there's no real way to actually get your token out of there. You basically have to redeploy your token. And that's what we had to, a lot of those projects have had to do. So we've worked with Alchemix, StapRadar, Beefy, and others to basically handle this situation where they had tokens that were minted and effectively owned by multi-chain that were not able to really be unwound, and where the liquidity was not able to be given back to the protocol. There was no way for them to actually have the flexibility to change their minds which bridge they wanted to work with. This is kind of, this like trade-off space is one that is really challenging to navigate, especially if you're a token issuer that isn't in a place where you can spend lots and lots of money on liquidity. And it's especially challenging when you think about, again, as I mentioned earlier, what happens when you start, you're not just talking about 5 chains or 10 chains, you're talking about hundreds of chains. The solution to this is the approach that I've kind of been talking about. So like with a token standard where you can have, mint and burn rights within the token, so nobody is really locking the tokens anymore. You are reducing the risk, the like kind of custody risk of each bridge, because nobody is holding a bunch of tokens that could get lost. You're also implementing these rate limits, and so you can limit the risk of any single bridge being hacked. And then lastly, because these limits and because the supported bridges are controlled by the token issuer, so in this case, for example, by Lido DAO or by Alchemix DAO or by Dapprators DAO, because the supported bridges are basically able to be are controlled and then able to be changed at any time by these DAOs. The DAOs can also change their minds and work to support better technology as it becomes available. So yeah, the kind of TLDR here is the goal of xERC20 is to provide a way for token issuers to maintain flexibility. It lets token issuers, if you're a person that's deploying a token and if you have a project that's trying to bring your token to many different chains, it lets you work with a bunch of different bridges without necessarily needing to work with only one, and lets you change your mind about which bridges you want to work with over time as better technology becomes available.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, thoughts on that. On my end, I wasn't even sure how complex this issue is, but now that you explained it, um, yeah, it's a big challenge that projects have to overcome, if they, want to go on one bridge and go on other bridges across different chains. So yeah, thanks for explaining that. That was very helpful. Yeah,
No problem.
yeah, and I wanted to ask a follow-up question in terms of what you guys are doing for the future to help out with this challenges. So I know that you guys are thinking about doing a DAO, going through that route, um, in order to be more permissionless, right? Because I think you mentioned before that one of the things you guys want to do for Connext is um, be more decentralized and permissionless. So do you want to
Yeah.
dive into that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So for clarity, we do have a DAO currently. We launched our token earlier this year, I guess a couple of months ago, and then launched the Connext DAO as part of that. And that's been honestly something that's been a really long time coming for us, and it's something that we've been extremely excited about. One of the things that, one of the biggest kind of challenges that we faced when doing that were these challenges of how do we launch our token in a way where we're not kind of fragmenting the liquidity of it on many different chains? How do we launch our token in a way where we're able to have users be able to claim that token on whatever chain they're on, because our user base is spread out across many different chains rather than being only in a single ecosystem? And then lastly, how do we have our DAO operate in a more chain agnostic way? So how do we have the DAO, our protocol is on many different chains today as well. So how do we have our DAO, which lives on Ethereum, control the protocol, be able to make decisions on updates to the protocol, support for new chains, things like that, even though those decisions are on many different chains, have all of those be controlled only from Ethereum? So those are some really interesting problems that we kind of solved for ourselves, and we've seen a lot of other projects run into as well, and we're helping other projects solve too. Now on the permissionless piece, I think right now it's possible for us to support new chains in our system, and that process involves going through a DAO vote. So the DAO has to basically explicitly approve a new chain to be added, because that process requires upgrading some of the core infrastructure on Ethereum in order to account for the fact that there's another chain. However, obviously that's a lot of overhead, right? So we can do that right now. We could maybe even get to the point where we can add multiple chains a week, but what happens if in a world where there's like people creating new rollups every day, or perhaps multiple new rollups every day? How can we actually like get to the point where it's so seamless, it's so simple to add support for new rollups to the network that we don't need to explicitly go and give permission to projects, or by we, I mean the Connext DAO doesn't need to explicitly give permission to projects to actually connect to the network. That's been one of the key problems here, and that's been what we're trying to solve. And this is, of course, this is a really hard problem, and it's going to take a very long time to solve. But we think that a lot of that ends up coming down to getting to the point where there's just like better standardization in the space around like what kinds of chains are going to exist, how to actually connect to those chains. So I think Orbit is like a really, really fantastic example here now, where because Orbit L3s all roughly look the same because they all connect to Arbitrum 1, there's a pretty straightforward path for us to be able to add them. And by making that path straightforward, we can also like then automate a lot of the process. And so that's kind of what I meant by like making the system permissionless. Is like I don't just mean that like it should be decentralized, because it is decentralized currently. And in fact, Connext is probably one of the more decentralized, if not one of the most decentralized systems out there for bridging today. But the bigger problem is like it shouldn't just be decentralized. It should be totally permissionless. Like you should be able to take whatever network you have and just be able to add it to the network without anyone ever being able to, like without anyone ever needing to be involved in that process except for you.
Yeah, that's very awesome. And yeah, I wanted to also ask, like, as a follow-up question, well, what are you most excited about this year or even next year for Connext? What are some things that the Arbitrum community should get excited about?
For sure. I think there's a few things. We're doing a lot of work right now to kind of understand the space and where it's headed. And there's two things, as I mentioned. There's two like big priorities for us, and they're simple priorities. It's like support for transferring tokens in a more seamless way. Part of that is happening through xERC20, but we're also working to like kind of build relationships with and perhaps even integrations with other settlement layers or other mechanisms to bring tokens across chains. And so we're really, really interested in we'll probably have some more like interesting updates around that at some point soon. But I think that is going to be how we bring down a lot of the costs of transferring tokens in the network. And then once you do that, then the cost of like doing messages also comes down very significantly. The second one that we're really excited about is of course the push around chains. So even before we really make of course there's this long-term vision of let's make the chains permissionless. But even before then, we're working to just now start like really accelerating the pace at which we bring on new ecosystems, and we work with some of the new rollups that are coming out. And I think there's going to be a lot of, we've kind of talked about this in our DAO, and there's actually an RFC right now. There's a couple of RFCs that have gone live around like chain support in the last couple of weeks in our DAO as well. But we're expecting to really accelerate that process, and our goal is to add, get to the point where we're adding dozens of chains before like the end of next quarter. We'll kind of see where we end up there. But we're trying to at least add another 10 chains at the end of Q1. So I think for us, it's a super exciting time where we're just in the process of growing a lot. So if you're interested in getting involved or interested in some of the things that we're like working on, these are two places where there's a lot of opportunities right now. So if you're a token issuer that wants to like take your token across chains, or if you're a chain that's doing something interesting, it's worthwhile to come talk to us.
Yeah, I really love the initiatives you guys are working on over there at Connext, and I'm sure the Arbitrum community is really excited for you guys to continue making an impact within the Arbitrum ecosystem. So yeah, we wish you guys the best, and congrats on everything that's been going on within the world of Connext.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, anytime. Yeah, so do you guys have like a Discord if like anybody have any questions? or a Telegram group, where can they go to ask any questions?
Yeah, so we do have a Discord. It's discord.gg/Connext. We are also, we have a bunch of different Telegram groups. They're a little bit more kind of specific to topics. So there's an xERC20 builders group and you can find the link to that on xerc20.com if you just scroll all the way to the bottom. And then, yeah, beyond that, you can always reach us through Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ConnextNetwork. Or check out our landing page, which is just connext.network. And yeah, if you're interested, definitely reach out. We're doing a lot of kind of interesting things related to Crosschain that I think can be really fantastic public goods for this space.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you, Arjun, for coming on and joining us today in our AMA. Sure, the community is really excited about what you guys are building. And yeah, thank you and have a great day, everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Shura, and thanks everyone for joining.